Today's reading comes from James chapter 5, verse 1 to 6, a warning to rich oppressors. Now listen, ye rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvester have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you.
So the passage that you just heard was one of the readings that's set today in the Church of England's calendar of readings. And it really stood out to me as I was reading it, because it really doesn't pull any punches, does it? It's got a bit of a flavour of sort of Old Testament about it, hasn't it? With the quite strong language. The way it sort of talks about telling the rich to weep and wail and how their wealth will testify against them on the judgment day. It's not messing around. And it's a passage that forms a very small part of two bigger themes that run right the way through the Bible. Firstly, the theme of God's special care for the poor and the marginalised. And secondly, the theme of how we as followers of God, as Christians, are called to relate to financial wealth. Now, both of those themes, as they're found in this reading, they kind of nudge us, or perhaps give us a great big kick towards self-reflection. So in this reflection today, what I'm going to do is firstly put the passage in a bit of context, just so that we can see clearly who James is speaking to and who he's speaking about. We'll take a look a bit at the content, the actual content, what James is saying and not saying about the rich and the poor and how they relate to money. And then once we've explored the context and the content, we'll confront ourselves with some reflection on what this passage might mean for us today. So in terms of context, with the strong words this passage uses, it's really important to get a sense of who James is speaking to before we can reflect on what the passage is saying to us. And that's because otherwise, with a passage like this, it's very easy to run the risk of either too hastily excusing ourselves from its consequences, or too readily feeling guilty about how we ourselves relate to money. So, if you flick back to the very first verse of the letter, you can see who it is that James is writing to. He's writing to the Jewish Christians who are scattered among the nations. You see, very early on in the life of the church, we're talking early 30s AD, most of the first Christians were living in and around Jerusalem. That was where kind of Christianity started and started from. But when the Christian leader Stephen was stoned, a sort of general persecution broke out against the Christians. And you can read in Acts 8, verse 1 and 11:19 about how Christians from Jerusalem, because of this persecution, were scattered across the nations where modern day Cyprus, Lebanon, Turkey and Syria, where those countries are today. So they were scattered across those areas because of persecution. And of course, whenever a people group gets displaced like that, they suffer social dislocation, but they also suffer economically and are vulnerable to being taken advantage of. And if you read the rest of James, which I encourage you to do because it's a really interesting letter, but if you read the rest of James, you'll see that his readers are facing various trials and persecutions and disadvantages. So James is writing to these scattered, dislocated Christians who find themselves in a very insecure situation. They obviously have no land of their own anymore because they've been flung far from their land. And so they need to work for others who do have land in order to make a living, in order to survive. Remember, this is taking place centuries before the Industrial Revolution, and so the vast majority of people get their livelihoods from agriculture. In other words, the displaced Christians, they're at the mercy of rich landowners. And that's the rich people that this passage is talking about. It's not really talking to them, it's talking about them. And those rich landowners, for the most part, they're not members of the church that the scattered Christians belong to. Instead, they're the ones that the Christians have no choice but to work for. Wealthy landowners, they were a particularly disreputable social class in the Greco-Roman world. They had a reputation for greedy acquisition of land and exploitation of those with no other economic options but to work for them. And so the context of this passage is that James is trying to bring comfort and encouragement to the economically poor and the insecure Christians that he writes to, who are faced with these greedy landowners who are exploiting them in their time of difficulty. What does that comfort that he's trying to offer look like? Well, now that we've painted a bit of a picture of the context, let's dive into the content. And it's worth noting kind of straight away, because it's kind of a controversial aspect of this, that when James condemns the rich, it's not being rich per se that he condemns. Now, of course, Jesus makes abundantly clear again and again that wealth can very, very easily become a barrier to being a disciple, to following Jesus. We can very easily make wealth a god, make wealth a focus. But there's actually nothing inherently or automatically evil about having wealth. There's another bit of the Bible that often gets misquoted as saying money is the root of all evil. But that verse, 1 Timothy 6 verse 10, it actually says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And that's the fundamental problem with the rich people in our passage here. It's that they love money. They clearly love money because they don't care who they hurt in order to get more of it. And James lists 4 distinct ways that their love of money manifests itself and at a cost to others. Firstly, there's the selfish hoarding of resources. Now, I'm sure we all remember last year the great toilet roll famine near the beginning of the pandemic, when a small number of people started buying up all the toilet rolls they could sort of fit in their cars, and the supermarket shelves were empty, which left many vulnerable people who perhaps couldn't afford to bulk buy in that way, or people who found it difficult to get to the shops. It left them without supplies. There was this sense that there were some people who were only thinking about themselves and their own security, looking after number one. So these landowners, they hoard far more wealth than they can spend. Maybe it's for the esteem that wealth brings in the eyes of many others. Maybe it's for security, because they're afraid that their circumstances might change. And so they want a nice big safety net for themselves. But they're hoarding their resources. Then there's the failure, number 2, the failure to pay the wages of their workers. The low-income Christians that we've kind of talked about, they would have lived at a subsistence level. Okay, having enough money day to day to buy their daily bread. And so withholding or delaying their wages, even by a day, could result in complete disaster. It could result in eviction. It could very quickly lead to starvation. So failure to pay the wages to the workers is a huge problem. The third way their love of money manifests is in luxury and self-indulgence. And in other words, an excessive love of the pleasures that money can be used to buy. And then you compare this to James's readers, for whom just feeding themselves and their families would feel like a victory. And lastly, they have condemned and murdered the innocent. We don't get any details on that, but this is presumably in a bid to get more land and more money. So James pulls no punches in condemning the rich landowners for the way that they relate to wealth, and in pronouncing judgment on the landowners. In doing that, James is saying 2 things to his audience, to the poor Christians he writes to. Firstly, he's saying, brothers and sisters, don't be jealous of the rich. Don't be jealous of them, because their earthly treasure is ultimately of no value to them. And secondly, James is reassuring his churches, his Christians, that come the judgment day, justice will be done. Justice will be done. Jesus talked a lot about how the first shall be last and the last shall be first, which means that those exploitative landowners, when they stand before Jesus one day, well, not only will their earthly treasures be of no value to them, James here is saying it will actually testify against them. I don't know what that looks like in practice, but for James's audience, he wanted them to know that they would receive justice, even if it wasn't in this life, that justice would come. They weren't in a position to necessarily change their situation in this life. They were at the mercy of much more powerful people. But James is saying justice will come. This passage fits in with a principle found throughout the Bible, and that is God's particular care for the poor and the marginalised. From the story of the Exodus through to Moses, to the wisdom literature, to the prophets, to the teachings of Jesus and then the apostles, right the way through the Bible, again and again it's clear that God is on the side of the poor. God loves and cares for us all equally, obviously loves everybody the same. But when we create by our actions an imbalance between ourselves, between rich and poor, when some make themselves prosperous at the expense of others, whether that's intentionally or through neglect, God is always on the side of the poor. So that's something of the content of what James is talking about, that for those Christians who are being subjected to the kind of persecution, in effect, of these wealthy landowners, he's saying to them, don't be jealous of them because their riches are not really ultimately worth anything, and do trust that justice will be done. And so what? So having looked at the context and having looked a bit at the content and seen the strong condemnation of these landowners, what does that say to us? And I think we can't help but confront ourselves with a passage like this one. How are we to hear James's strong words? Are we in a position where we are comforted by the fate of the rich, like James hoped his original readers would be? Or if we find ourselves more in the category of wealthy than poor and persecuted, do we excuse ourselves from this criticism of the landowners? Do we feel enormously guilty about our own lifestyle and suddenly think our only option is to sell all we possess and give it all to the poor, perhaps making ourselves poor in the process? Or do we do our best to sort of ignore James because it's really quite uncomfortable? Well, our response to this passage will depend in part on our own circumstances, our own specific circumstances. And it's important to remember that there's no easy kind of black and white answer. There's no line we can draw in our bank accounts and say, okay, this much money is fine, but this much money is too much. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. It's about our heart relationship to money, to God, and to our fellow human beings, a heart relationship to those different things, which kind of needs constant attention and thought and revisiting. So since I can't tailor this reflection to your unique circumstances and your unique heart, I'm simply going to pose us all some questions that pop out at me from this passage. That's what I'm going to do to finish this reflection. And if a question strikes you as worth pondering, which I hope at least one of them does, then I suggest you pause the reflection or write down the question and spend some time reflecting on it for yourself. So the first question to reflect on then is, do I envy those who are visibly wealthy? James really wanted to put material wealth in its place, reminding his readers that it would rot and it would rust. So what's our perspective on material wealth? That's the first question to ponder. Another question we can ask ourselves is, do my spending habits reflect self-care or self-indulgence? We all benefit emotionally from the odd treat, whether that be sitting in a coffee shop or buying something nice for dinner or whatever it is that gives you a bit of a boost. Things that are good for our well-being. That's okay, especially in a tough time like this. We are kind of called to enjoy and embrace life. But we can reflect on whether that spending of our money on well-being goes kind of beyond that care for ourselves, that love, appropriate love for ourselves, beyond that to self-indulgence. That's something to reflect on. We can also ask a broader but very important foundational question, and that's, do I see my money as part of my discipleship? You know, our whole lives, including our whole incomes, they belong to God. You know, we are not the owners of anything. Even if our name is on the bank account or on the deed of the house, we're not owners, we are stewards. So when we spend even as much as a penny, do we recognise that that spending is part of our Christian life, part of our Christian discipleship? And then last, but by no means least, if we put ourselves in the position of the rich, which frankly in the West many of us are rich in relative terms, then how does our relationship with wealth affect the poor and the marginalised? You know, how does the way we spend our money affect those who are poor, who are marginalised, who struggle? I suspect very few of us withhold wages from workers. I hope none of us do that. But when we go shopping, do the purchases we make contribute to workers somewhere being kept in poor conditions or being underpaid, having wages effectively withheld? You know, can we make ethical choices in our shopping to encourage fairer wages? And I'm sure many of us already do that. But this is an invitation to reassess and revisit that, to kind of have a bit of a spending MOT. So that's plenty to think about. And I hope that you are able to take some time to think about it, because there are a few things, I believe, that are as important to living out our faith. A few things that are as important as the money we have and how we use it. You know, James is asking some really hard questions of us through this passage. And so I hope you're able to reflect on that. And I'd love to hear your reflections, and I'd love you to challenge me on how I've reflected on this. Because it's not just for me to talk at you, it's part of my journey as well. So thank you for taking the time to listen this morning and to reflect. Amen.